Hello. I was planning on going over this material in class, but since I can't be there this evening, I thought that I would do this and put it together and hopefully have a conversation, although a bit one way, about the hot dog cart and bring up some points that I think are relevant and important when we think of this very simple business and various different ways that we can grow it. So let's take a look at a few things. First of all, we talked about taking out a loan for $40,000. And if we assume a 5-year loan at, let's say, I think 10% interest, that turns out to be almost $850 a month that you got to pay back. So that means you need to generate a fair amount of additional revenue if you're going to take on that loan. Roughly, if we're able to get a 10-year loan, it would be half that approximately. So that's just sort of something to think about from the point of view of, number one, taking out a loan, going into debt to expand and grow your business. Now, let's take a look at two basic overall general categories that we can think about. One is we can talk about having more carts. The other one is other ways of increasing revenues. Okay, so both of those, more carts would of course increase revenues, but there may be ways of increasing revenue without having to acquire additional carts. So let's take a minute and look into each one of these and some of the pluses and minuses associated with each of these two broad categories. Okay, so let's take a look at more carts. Or at least in this case, one more cart. And let's look at, let's say, some pluses and some minuses about having one additional cart. So what are some of the minuses or the risks as you might think about them? So one is you're going to have increased operating cost. Right, so this is clear. Not only you're going to have the loan cost that you're going to have to pay back of approximately $850 a month, but you're also going to have some additional operating cost such as fuel, such as inventory, right? So you're going to have to keep more inventory on hand because you're supplying two carts. So you either need to get some more space or maybe you won't be able to park the car in your garage anymore. You're going to have transportation cost, right? So these things don't stay, they're not permanent overnight. So either you or, and maybe in this case, your employee needs to tow them around. So maybe there's some insurance. Speaking of employees, you're probably going to have an employee. So there's certainly cost associated with that, not just wages and salary, but also Social Security taxes, payroll taxes, workman's comp, etc. So those are just a couple of things that are going to increase your operating cost going forward. And that's really before you made any additional sales. Now, let's take a look at some of the factors on the revenue side. So one is trying to figure out the location. Right, I think we talked about your existing cart is up near the state capitol, up around where there's probably a good lunch business. So if you think about the lunch business, it probably runs from 11:30 to maybe 1:30, right? And that's when you're making hay. There's probably not very much of a big dinner business up there. And you know, you're not selling breakfast burritos more likely. So this is when you got to do it. So as you think of other locations, What's one way to approach this? Do you want to get something complimentary so that you're going after a different crowd? So one location might be something other than a lunch crowd. So what would something possibly be other than a lunch crowd? Well, maybe down near the Pepsi. So you're looking at events, right? So you're not looking at a lunch crowd. Or maybe it's still a lunch crowd, but it's out near corporate woods, right? Large office complex where there's lots of people looking for something to eat during lunch. Or maybe it's up in Clifton Park, again, where there's a good lunch crowd. Or maybe it's in Lake George, where it's a very different crowd. And you can probably, the lunch in the tourist business probably stretches well into the afternoon. And that might be another approach to expanding your business. It's something else to think about. So let's talk now a little bit about lunch versus tourist or events. Right? So what are some of the pluses and minuses as we think about that? So if we look at lunch, some of the good things about lunch is it's steady, right? It's Monday through Friday. You probably get a repeat business. It's short in time. So from a staffing perspective, probably going 11:30 to 1:30 for your volume. So that's the good pieces about it. Okay, if we looked at tourist or events, what are some of the things there? Well, let's just stick on the tourist for a second. So this could probably be effective from 10 o'clock in the morning to maybe even 7 at night if you're selling hot dogs, right? If you think about Lake George, for example. So that's very different. Or if you think about events that are all-day events, or not, or a better part of a day, as opposed to a concert, which or a football game or a basketball game, those things are really short. But let's think of longer-term events like a concert or something, set up outside a SPAC where people are, when Phish is in town, people are hanging out for a couple of days. So maybe a longer time to sell. Maybe you can sell different types of things at events. So menu, maybe you could have higher margins, right? Or prices, because tourist events are probably less price sensitive than the lunch crowd. So if you think of the lunch crowd, they're probably very price sensitive, right? So here, tourist side, maybe you could have slightly larger margins and make a little bit of more money on that, which of course would be a way to increase your revenues. So let's see, what else can we think about here in these things? So here again, we're just focused on having another cart. So if you're having another cart, where are you going to put it? What type of business are you going to have? Can you generate enough additional revenue to pay off the loan and some of your increased operating cost? So you have the financial spreadsheets there that I gave you, and there you can make some rough calculations about how much money you can actually make in this type of business. Oh, so let's think of something else. If we think of the lunch crowd, what's the season? Probably maybe April through October would be my guess. I think it might be tough standing out there in a hot dog cart in November, December, or February. Tourist season is probably shorter. So the tourist season is more like June through September, right? So a little shorter, longer days, probably a much better opportunity to sell for a longer period of time, more volume, but the season is actually shorter. So that's another thing to think about. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit and then let's look about increasing revenues for our existing cart. So maybe not taking out such a large loan and buying another cart and incurring all those expenses, but are there things that we can do with our existing business to increase our revenues? So let's take a look at several different opportunities here, options. One is we can look at location. We already talked about the lunch business and sort of the pluses and minuses, but there's more lunch business than just around the Capitol. So maybe someplace where there's less competition, so we can increase our prices a little bit maybe. And remember, in these types of businesses, every 5 cents you increase your prices, that fundamentally goes straight to your bottom line. So if it doesn't impact your revenue in a negative way, that money goes directly to the bottom line, which is a good thing. We talked about corporate woods, right? Different type of lunch business. Clifton Park. There's the RPI Technology Park. So these are all other large congregations of working people who have to have lunch, and oftentimes hot dog cart is a great way to do that. The other thing we talked about is the tourist business, right? Lake George. So maybe we do the lunch business in Albany around the Capitol, and then at 1:30 we pack up, and then we drive to Lake George for the 3 to 7 p.m. dinner shift, if you will, trying to sell hot dogs there. So that's another option as well. Same thing with shows or concerts. Again, these are short duration, but they might be ways of increasing your revenues at non-lunch time. So you're not subtracting from your lunch business, but you're adding a different business. Now, if you think about adding different businesses, adding different sets of customers, right? So it's not the office person who's coming out, grabbing something to either quickly eat outside if it's a nice day or something they're taking back to their office to eat. But you're talking about tourists or concert goers, etc. Are there some other things we can do to increase our business? So let's take a look at that, or increase our revenues. Let's going to go to the next slide to do that. So now we're going to take a look at, we're selling to the non-lunch crowd. So let's say tourist or events. Does that give us additional opportunities? Well, maybe we can sell some other things that the lunch crowd may not be that interested in. Like what, you might ask? Well, if we're up at Lake George, maybe we would sell on hot days a lot more water. High margin item. Maybe we'd sell sunscreen, sunglasses, hats, right? So now all of a sudden, maybe there's some associated inventory carrying cost with this, stuff doesn't go bad. So it's not like hot dog buns, it's going to go stale. So you can order some, sell them all summer long. So that's a good thing. Maybe you could even sell t-shirts. Gus's hot dog cart t-shirts. Maybe candy or snacks, right? So snacks is probably pretty good, particularly if you're hanging out for longer periods of time. You have your tourists walking around. They don't want a hot dog, but maybe they'll buy a Snickers bar or a bag of chips and a soda, a granola bar, who knows what, right? Typically, again, higher prices, which is good, higher prices because they're less price sensitive. So that's something you can think about as a way of increasing your revenues and building and growing your business. All right, so let's take a look at that. And I think that's all I had to say on sort of the tourist events type of business. But you can get creative here is the whole point, and you can think about other things to sell. And as you do this, again, this is without buying another cart. This is marginal incremental cost, so the risk is lower. But of course, maybe the payout's not as big. So one, part of this is utilization of the existing carts you have, particularly if you think about the plan of, I'm going to do the lunch business where I currently do it because I'm doing well, but then I'm packing up and I'm driving to the Pepsi or I'm driving up to Lake George to capture the afternoon, early evening business. So lots of things to think about here. Let's go on to the next slide. So just to summarize so far, a couple of different approaches. One is to add another cart. You're going to take out a loan. It's going to cost you money, has some risk. You got to figure out where to put it because you're not going to compete against yourself. So it definitely needs another location, needs an employee. And then we talked about a whole bunch of different ways of potentially increasing your revenues. Well, you can still do those if you add another cart, although you're probably not going to have both your carts up in Lake George. So you got to sort through that. Maybe Lake George is big enough to support two carts up there. So this is all a matter of doing some analysis, trying to understand what the increased revenues can be, trying to shift to higher margin products, trying to shift to places where there's less price sensitivity, less competition. So those are all good ways of thinking about how to expand an existing business. And if you think about this, jeepers, it's just a hot dog cart, right? And we've already spent a significant amount of time here talking about various different scenarios that you might be able to increase your business. Now, we already talked about the businesses here, upstate New York. You're probably going to be doing something else in November, December, January, February, March. Maybe you'll be a ski bum or something. But you're probably not selling a lot of hot dogs. You're certainly not selling anything up in Lake George because that place is closed, and maybe around the capital, but it's going to be slim pickings. So I think one of the other questions I wanted to have you answer or ponder or think about, is what if this business was located in San Francisco? How might it be different? Well, let's take a look. I think it was Mark Twain or some famous guy said the coldest winter he ever experienced was a summer in San Francisco or something like that. So let's think about San Francisco. It's the same temperature for 12 months a year, pretty much, right? So that's good, long season. It's not very hot, it's cool, sometimes damp. So what does that mean? So think about your customers. Maybe, again, thinking about lunch, let's just focus on a lunch business. But maybe now you have hot coffee, hot chocolate, right? A little bit different. Maybe There's things that you can sell like hats to keep people warm, gloves, right? I can remember being in San Francisco many times, and the tourists often think, hey, it's California, it's going to be sunny, it's going to be warm, and it's one of those cool, damp, foggy, windy days, and people are freezing. Maybe umbrellas, right? So again, a bunch of different ways that you might be able to expand your business. Think about a different location. Think about some of the advantages, disadvantages of a different location. And here we're talking about a very different, climate location, as a matter of fact. So that really makes it challenging and interesting, and an ability to explore various different ways of growing the business. Let's take a look at Miami next. I think that's the other thing I asked you to think about. Okay, I think the other question was Miami. What about how would the business be slightly different there? Well, Miami is sunny, it's hot, so you can sell, in addition to hot dogs, more cold drinks, probably water, sunscreen / lotion, sunglasses, shade hats. Maybe, given Miami and the sort of international flair that it has, so maybe something other than hot dogs. Higher margin stuff. Maybe some Cuban food. Slightly higher margins than hot dogs. So again, lots of different potential opportunities. If you're in Miami down by the beach, it's going to be a little bit different than if you're in 4 or 5 or 6 blocks. So interesting how many different variables there are in such a simple business as the hot dog cart business. Now, let's summarize all of these things a little bit. So, let's take a look at the summary. So what's the number one point here, lesson I want you to try to take away from here? One is be customer driven, right? If your customers don't buy something, if you don't have what they're looking for, you're not selling anything. You're not making revenue. So think about where your customers are, think about what their needs are, and don't limit yourself to selling just hot dogs, right? There's a lot of other auxiliary items that you can sell, and oftentimes for much higher margins. So this is a great, great thing. So that's real important. Number two, think about the environment. Number three, more hot dog carts may not be the absolute best way of doing it. It's often something we jump to, but maybe what you want to do is you want to maximize your revenue with one cart, take that learning from there, and then add the second cart, right? But first, maximize your revenue with one cart. Also, remember, alone or cart number two increases your cost significantly. So you got to make a significant amount of extra money. I hope you found this simple little exercise fun and interesting, and gives you some food for thought for all the various different ways there are to look at a very simple business and possibly increase your revenues. So you expand this into more complex businesses, and you can understand why it deserves a lot of analysis, a lot of thinking, and a lot of planning to be successful. Thanks again, and I'm sorry we had to do it this way, but it's sort of beyond my control. I couldn't be here this evening, and so I thought I'd put this together along with some additional things for class tonight, which you'll see in Moodle, and I hope it's a good experience for you all. See you next week, I promise. Thanks. Bye-bye.